What's up, everybody? Robert Thompson here with part four of my writing process. A little bit late. Done a lot of writing on that script so far today, and I'm kind of feeling it. So I apologize if I'm not as overly energetic as I have been the past couple days. Eyes are hurting from staring at the monitors, so of course I took a break to stare at different monitors. Uh, but yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. So, we've covered three parts so far. The first part was just your basic introduction as far as screenwriting software, stuff like that. I'm assuming that you've never written a script before. We've looked at some free script writing software, some software that you would pay for. I use Final Draft. That was the first part, an introduction. Second part was the beginning or the first act of the script. The second and the third video was for the second act, basically bringing us up to page 70 to 75 of 90 for your average script. Again, this is not a script that I'm working on. This is not an actual idea. The details of it themselves are entirely made up. They're not factual, and as I've said in the other videos, you can stretch the truth, you can't break it. People will call you out on it if you flat out just ignore facts in a story. If you've not watched the other videos, there are three parts before this one. Go back and give those a watch. I know that they are kind of long. I apologize for that. I don't apologize for the content. They are necessary to be that long because I had quite a bit to say about the subject. So, bringing it up to part 4, this is Act 3. Okay, this is the payoff. Act 2's climax leading into this act. Generally speaking, the climax is a part of Act 3. I tend to start it a little bit earlier, but it's leading into Act 3, which is the payoff of the movie. We have our slasher film, we have our slasher idea. We are based on the serial killer Ted Bundy, telling a fictional retelling of how he became the monster that we know of from his college years and on. So, right now we have the climax of the movie. We're sitting at about page 70 to, this is the end or Act 3. Sitting at page 70 to 75, somewhere in there, out of 90. You have 20 minutes to wrap everything up. Okay, you have to get the finish line crossed within these 15 to 20 pages. So looking at the slasher Ted Bundy idea, going back to what I covered in the last video, let's say all the characters are dead. The climax of the movie, she's realized, his girlfriend has realized that Ted is a serial killer, is a killer, is lost to her, is lost to the world. As I mentioned, you have to have that moment where there's a realization for him that he is a monster. So going into Act 3, the climax is the main event. It is the fight. So in these first few pages of end of Act 3, assuming that you write in the style that I do, you have about 15 pages left to get to the end. Going into the climax, she's been fighting with Ted. He gets the upper hand. He stabs her, he beats her, whatever. He generally speaking, whoever your main character is, typically the female, needs to be shown ultimately and specifically weaker than her adversary. Mentally, physically, whatever. Not because I'm not saying that because women are weak. No. They have to be shown as weaker because they have to have the moment where they overcome that weakness. That is how they win at the end of the movie, not because they are actually stronger than the villain. Okay? They have to have a moment where they come back. So at this point, at page 75, he's beaten her to the point of death, has a knife. Let's say he ends up tackling her or body slams or whatever. She ends up on the ground. She's hurt, she's bleeding, she's crying, she's doing everything she can at this point just to keep breathing. You have to have that moment where we're going to call it this. There are better terms for it, but I'm going to call it this. You have to have that moment around page 75 to 80. Sorry. The moment where it appears that she's been defeated. Now, if you really want to throw a curveball and you're a good enough storyteller to finish it off properly, he would kill her and you would end the movie with a surprise, with a shocking twist. Okay, we're not going to do that. We're writing an actual slasher. She has to at least live through to the end of the movie. So the end is nigh moment comes up where he, let's say, when she's on the ground, he picks up his knife. She had knocked it away from him. She was going in her attempt to come back during the fight sequence. She has to have a moment where it seems like she's going to be okay or get the upper hand. So she would, like, for instance, knock away the knife or the weapon that the killer is using, something along those lines, before she gets caught in a detrimental predicament, which is the body slam that I mentioned, just for an example. He picks up his knife, goes and he gets on top of her. He's about to stab her, put in the final stab. And generally, this is where you would use the cliche of the villain monologue. You ask what a monologue is. A monologue is the villain having that one last thing to say that they didn't need to say. Or rather, they needed to say it, but they choose the wrong moment to have to say it. In this monologue, he would say something that would trigger her to react not as a victim, but as a survivor. And as a survivor, that's what gets her to the end of the movie. So in that moment of his monologue, he would say something that would trigger her to go into survival mode. She would fight back at the very last second. Because you want to increase the tension as much as possible. Tension is a very difficult thing to write. You will find as you practice more, you get more into the rhythm of the script and the rhythm of things like tension and comedy, things like that. Um, but at the very last moment, when the knife's about to just about to come down or coming down, she fights back, um, and gets him, like, she gets him off of her. She has a moment where she's freed. She's won that round. Okay, for example, um, the last 10 pages or so, 10 to 12, 15. That's pushing it. 15 for a 90-minute movie. The last 10 to 12 pages is now the fallout of what happens next. Either the villain is killed, the villain is subdued, stopped somehow. The villain has to meet their end in some way. This is technically a origin story for our slasher. So we can't kill Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy can't die. Can't die. Because he has to go on and kill other people. He has to escape. So there's a couple different ways you can do that. My first thought, and the one that gives him the most understanding and reason for running away, would be that at some point the cops were called during his massacre, and you would have sirens come in the background, driving as they approach, flashing lights in the distance and stuff like that. Something he would see that he would think, I need to get out of here. She's alive, but fuck it. I'm better off running than I am getting caught by them. So, if your villain can't die for whatever reason, we happen to choose a villain that has to live. We have to carry that story on, that because that's a fact we knew at the beginning. He kills more people. That's how he becomes Ted Bundy. This is his origin story. So he makes it through. At the end of that origin story, those last 10 pages are your wrap up. Within your wrap up, you're going to cover. You have to cover a couple major things, considering that he got away. One, what happens to Sharon? Let's come back to that one, because I have an idea. The other main thing that you have to cover is what happened to Ted. Where is Ted? Ted got away. At that time in society, security wasn't as major, computers weren't as popular, stuff like that. So it was very difficult to keep track of people. It wouldn't have been impossible for him to move somewhere else and start over without changing very little. It would have been another decade or two before he got to the point where it was like, this guy is, before the government knew where he was at all times. So you generally want to show the character in something, I would say, since we're starting into the college age for the slasher movie, we're setting up who Ted Bundy is as society knew him. You would have a scene written into these last 10 pages where Ted interacts with, a couple sorority girls or something along those lines. And you finish it on, his smile or a moment where a freeze frame where he is going to do what he does. It doesn't have to be shown, but what comes next. Going back to Sharon, how I would play out the last 10 pages is I would do a fast forward of, say, 6 months or whatever. She's graduated, went to college, and say one of her friends invites her to go to a party. A lot of fraternity guys will be there. It'll be a good time. Go have fun, get drunk. It'll be whatever. She goes, and at this party, she's introduced to a guy who, in the last moments of the film, turns around and she sees that it's Ted stalking her. And that's how the movie ends. That leaves an ambiguous ending that we really don't know if she lives, if she dies, if Ted wins. But that's kind of how I would process the ending, the last 10 pages or so of the movie. That leaves, it gives a finite ending to this story. She lived. He got away. It processes his story into the reality of the situation of his existence moving forward into his college years. But it also leaves on a very interesting note and a particular aspect that I am a big fan of. If there's any way to leave a movie on it, either at the very end or in a mid or post-credit scene, you want to set that up. A sequel or a franchise. And in a way, the idea that I just laid out to how this movie, I would end this script with it being ambiguous. Sharon could be a final girl that lives to a sequel, or we could immediately start the sequel telling what happened to her, which is that she died. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter to this story. We're telling this story at the moment, but I always like to leave the door open, if possible, for something more. Because the last thing I want to ever get caught on is telling a story, laying it out, and it somehow becomes a hit. I apologize. It somehow becomes a hit, and you don't know what to do with the character moving forward. So I always try to have something ready, just a little stinger at the end to leave it ambiguous enough to leave it open for a sequel or franchise opportunity. That being said, you've now completed your 90-page script. All right? Your beginning, middle, and end. You've conceptualized characters. You've given them an arc. You've given them a reason to exist, a story to tell, and a point to get to that ends your story. So that is the general basis for how I go about creating every script that I work on. Research, start with the first draft, and this is the layout that I go for when writing. At that point, your 90 pages are complete. You write, as I said at the beginning in one of the other videos, fade in is how your script would always start. This is how it always ends. At the bottom center of your page, the end, period. You have a couple options here. Period denotes finality. You have told the story is done, it's over. Your 90 pages are your 90 pages. Question mark. Is your story done? Or is this just part of your story? And I often find that when it comes to sequels or franchise ideas, I get those as I'm writing a script. So that's part of why I always leave it open, is because I come up with ideas as I'm writing on how to further a character or further a story. So the end, period. Congratulations, you've now written your first 90-page script. What do you do with it? Well, gonna have to check back for the next part.